Good. So I'm Jeff Powles. I have the privilege of owning Fish on Colorado, which is a guide service here in the state, and then also River Bum, which is a e-commerce fly shop. I've been guiding for, I've had Fish on Colorado. This will be our 7th season. Our first season we had 17 trips. Last year we had 374 trips. And we've just grown organically by doing presentations like this and some trade shows, and it's been a great ride. So I'd like to thank Downriver for having me here tonight. They've been a great partnership. I've done a couple presentations over the years, and all of our equipment we get from Downriver. They make a great product, and thank you guys very much. Really appreciate everything you guys do for us. So tonight we're going to talk about tips and tricks of rowing to catch more fish. So how many of you have your own boat already? How many of you have a friend that knows how to row so you get to fish? Yeah. All right, good. Good. Well, that friend should be here with you tonight. So yeah, we're going to talk about rowing, and there's a big difference of. Let me turn this on. There's a big difference. Let me get closer. Is it going? No? I may have you just hit forward on that, David. Just hit the space bar. All right, technical difficulties. I think we have to click on the slide itself. Oh, where's the mouse? There it is. Okay, bear with us 1 second. There we go. Okay, so there's a big difference between rowing for whitewater, having fun, going down the river, splashing, and rowing for fishing. Two completely different objectives that take place throughout the day. You can mix them throughout the day, but it's very difficult to do both of them at the same time during the day. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. The number one goal in both situations is just get down the river safe. You want to have the right side up when you're exiting at the boat ramp. That's kind of critical. Second goal then, obviously it's a little different for each, the thrill of the float versus catching more fish. So float fishing rowing tactics. The biggest thing that I noticed as far as the difference between whitewater and fishing is you want to slow everything down. So when you're floating down the river, whether it's in a dory, a drift boat, a raft, a personal pontoon, personal flotation device, whatever it is, you want to be going slower than the current. So you're always rowing backwards. That's probably the biggest mistake I see people do that are out there trying to fly fish, and you got the rower pushing downstream to get around a rock or to get around something. It's all about that back row to slow things down. So keep that in mind. The backstroke, we use it as guides 90% of the time. You're constantly just rowing backwards. And you point to the danger, whatever that is, if you want to go around it. So if there's a big boulder or you have Needle's Eye on Upper Colorado, you kind of point towards that wall on the left side if you're going around it, and you pull away from it. If you're on the right side going through it, you want to point towards all those rocks sticking out on the right bank and pull away from it. So always point to the danger and then row backwards away from it. By rowing backwards, that is your strongest stroke. You can move the boat fastest by rowing backwards as opposed to pushing. You want to get out of the main current when you're fishing, so there's great ways to do that. Everybody knows what an eddy is. Anyone not know what an eddy is? And I'm not talking about Eddie from Leave It to Beaver. So eddies, it's a slow part on the river where you might have a peninsula that sticks out, and then behind that peninsula, the current actually circulates upstream, and that's a great place to pull a boat in and kind of slow down. So get out of the main current. Another thing for fishing is put the fishermen where the fish actually are. So fish don't live everywhere in the river, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. As you're rowing for fishing, just like you would if you're rowing for whitewater, you're focused downstream. You're looking downstream for, gosh, where's that hole? A hole that a boat could fall in and flip. Where's that rock? Where's that strainer? Well, for fishing, you're looking downstream for where's the target? Where's that eddy line where the fast water meets the slow water? Where's that boulder where you have a fish hanging out in front of the boulder or behind the boulder? So where are those targets? And that's what you're looking for downstream, in addition to being able to get the boat down safe. Well, there we go. And then lastly, as you're floating for fishing, you have all different types of anglers and abilities. So you want to be able to put the boat within your fisherman's ability to fish to those fish in the river. So in other words, if your buddy can only cast 20 feet, don't put the boat 40 feet away from the target, unless he owes you a lot of money or he didn't bring the beer or something like that day. But you always want to use the boat as a tool to actually get closer to the fish. So additional tactics that we always like to have is multiple rods set up at one time. So multiple rods being, if you're fly fishing or spin fishing, it really doesn't matter. But if you're fly fishing, you want to have a couple different rods, because what happens is when you snag up on the bottom of the river, when you're floating downstream, you don't have the option to just go right back upstream and pull it out like when you're wade fishing. So that gives you the ability, great, you break off, reach down, grab the next rod, you're still in a good fishy spot and you're fishing again right away. So have multiple rods set up. Always cast away from the boat. That might sound like common sense, but it's amazing how many people don't necessarily cast away from the boat when we're guiding them, or they're casting back behind the boat. So you have this 14-foot shadow moving downstream. It's gonna spook fish. So cast away from the boat. And pay attention to your shadow. I don't know if I have that up there or not. We'll talk about that. But pay attention to your shadow. So your shadow, it's not always directly below the boat. So early morning, late evening, that shadow is off at an angle, and that shadow is going to spread another 10, 15, 20 feet away from where you actually are. That shadow is going to spook, it's going to spook fish. So cast away from the boat. I always say cast to a location where those fish have not been spooked, which is typically downstream. So you want to cast downstream of the boat, away from the boat, where the shadow hasn't been, or where the shadow won't even be, for your best opportunity to get into fish. Set on every tick. That's for fly fishing purposes. Every time, if you're nymphing, if you see an indicator that just twists, just dips, if it goes sideways, it doesn't matter. You want to set. As guides, that's a word that we say quite a bit out on the water. Hey, set. By the end of the day, it's like, hey, Dennis, you probably should have set on that because that was probably a fish. We say that a lot. So always set on every little tick. The boat is moving downstream. Okay, so as the boat moves downstream, there's all kinds of different currents that the boat's floating through. As you float through those currents, your fly line, as it lays on the water, is kind of moving around doing all kinds of funky stuff. Well, you want to always be mended, and mend is when you take your fly line and you flip it in the direction that would allow your indicator to float naturally. So if your indicator is floating slower than the current, and your line is all over the place, you're going to mend or flip your line downstream, which allows that indicator to then float faster or with the current. If it's floating faster than the current, typically you're going to mend upstream, and that's going to slow that down to where it's floating with the current. So you have a great opportunity when you're fly fishing in a boat. That opportunity is you are able to float at the exact same pace as the current. So when a fish is looking for food, it's looking for food that's bouncing and tumbling in the water, and it's bouncing and tumbling in the water at the same speed as the water. So if you have a bug that's bouncing on the bottom, it's going to bounce with the current. A fish knows if that bug is accelerating and going faster than the current, and it's not going to eat. Conversely, if it's going slower than the current as well, hey, that looks weird, I'm not going to eat. So it's about making sure that you're drifting your bugs all at the same pace as the water is. Okay. That's probably the biggest mistake that most people have is to be fishing in a location that's really fishy, but everything that you're doing is going faster or slower than the current. A fish is not going to eat that. So keep that in mind. And mending helps fix that. It goes back to presentation is critical. We just talked about that. And again, slow the boat down. So by slowing the boat down, the boat's going a little bit slower than the current. That gives the angler an opportunity to cast several times into a target. If you're going faster than the current and you're just cruising downriver, an angler's going to cast really far downstream, let those bugs sink, and then the boat catches up to it and he's recasting again. So always slow down. That gives the angler more opportunities to cast to a target. We'll talk about targets in a bit too. We talked about using eddies to slow down. Okay, so this is pretty critical. Once you know where fish are hanging out, where they're holding, focus in on those targets throughout the entire day. Most people think that, well, gosh, there's a hatch that's going to come off, it's going to change. The fish aren't going to change locations for the most part. They might change the type of bug that they're eating, but they're going to be hanging out in that same type of water for most of the day, most of the time. I'll never say 100%, but most of the time. When you're wade fishing, you walk up to a hole and you have 100 casts at that same hole to try to get a fish out of it. When you're floating, you have 1, maybe 2, if you're going slow enough, 3 casts at a hole, but you're going to see 100 different targets during the day. So it's really important that once you know where the fish are hanging out, if they're in deep holes, then great, let's go ahead and just float through the shallow riffles, have a beer, grab a sandwich, smoke a cigar, and then when you get to the next deep hole, then go ahead and fish. Don't waste your time or energy fishing where fish aren't going to be. Oh, hey, look at that. And fish don't live everywhere in the water. So I told a client the other day that 125% of all fish, of 80% of all fish caught are caught in the water. So one of the biggest things that we run into is, yeah, they're in the water, but they're not everywhere in the water. Rivers are huge. They're vast. There's deep pools. There's shallow riffles. There's shorelines. There's the middle of the fast current. There's slow eddies. There's all kinds of places that fish may or may not be. So they don't live everywhere. We're going to show you a slide here in a bit, but they look for a few things. They always look for shelter. What's an example of shelter? Cut bank. What was that in the back? Structure. What type of structure? Log, a rock. Yep, absolutely. What about overhanging trees on the bank? Great shelter for fish. So look for shelter. Fish always need shelter. The reason they need that shelter is to survive from a predator. So if there's shelter there, it's much more difficult for a bird to come down and get them because they can see that shadow and then dart off to where it's safe. They're always looking for a food source. So a food source is typically in a faster current. So if you as a rafter or a whitewater person, you typically look for what to identify where the faster current is? Well, whitewater, yeah.
Bubbles.
Bubbles, there you go. Bubble lines. So a bubble line is where you have all these currents that come together. They all converge, and they always form this bubble line. And that bubble line not only is the fastest current, but that bubble line 9 out of 10 times, all these currents come together, all that food that's in this river, they all come together in that bubble line. So you want to look for the bubble line. There's a saying for fly fishing, foam is home. So think of that when you're fishing. So look for food. Oxygen, fish need oxygen to live. They breathe water. In the water is the oxygen. They need oxygen. So ways to get oxygen in the water, obviously below rapids, below riffles, different things like that, plunge pools, so they need oxygen. There's a couple sections on the upper Colorado that are known as the lakes between Radium and Rancho del Rio. Just these big sections of kind of flat water. The wind's always blowing 20 miles an hour back upstream. There's not a lot of oxygen in that water down there. We tend to kind of just push through that as guides. There's there's less fish in that area. Fish near a fast current. Notice the word near. You don't want to fish in the fast current because fish are extremely lazy. They're going to hang out right next to the fast current, go out, get that food, come right back in. They're going to go out, get the food, and come right back in. So eddy lines are something that's always really important to look for. Look for that fast water meeting the slow water, and then fish that seam. It's called a seam where the fast water meets the slow water. Bubble lines, we talked about that. We talked about eddies. And here's the thing that people in boats always do, and it's always smart to do. You're going to always be casting towards the bank, 2 to 6 feet to the bank, 9 out of 10 times. A bank provides structure. A bank provides slower current near faster water, and there's always food along the bank. When you guys go wade fishing, we crack up because everyone's casting out to the middle of the river. It's like, why are you doing that? Go close to the bank. Boulders, that's another type of shelter. And pools is a deeper drop off where there's just a slow current. So those are things that fish look for. Those are the targets that as you're floating downstream you want to look for. So here's just a quick little picture. Make sure you know the difference between river right and river left. A lot of times when you're with an angler and you're rowing the boat, you're going to say, hey, cast over to the right. Well, the guy's turned around in the back of the boat and his right's over here, but river right is really over there. So river right is always looking downstream on the right side. River left is always looking downstream on the left side. Understand on a boat who you want to have in the front and who you want to have in the back. We base it purely off of casting skill. So the better caster for fly fishing is always in the back of the boat. Back of the boat. So the reason for that is if you're not that good as your partner casting, in the front of the boat, you have 180 degrees all around you that you could flail around, you could do whatever you want. It doesn't really affect the person in the back. Person in the back, they have to be a little bit more accurate, hitting these targets, casting forward up by the oars. We have a diagram that's going to show this in just a couple slides. Streamers, how many of you guys like to streamer fish? Okay, where do you want to be if you're streamer fishing, front or back? Back.
Back.
Back. There you go. Nice answer, Jeff. So the back, and the reason for the back is when you're streamer fishing, it imitates a bait fish or a small minnow, something along those lines. When you have a predator that comes out and chases a bait fish, does that bait fish swim upstream or downstream? Yeah, it takes off and it runs downstream. So if you're casting in the back of the boat towards the back diagonal towards the shore, you're pulling it, you're stripping it downstream. So always be thinking of that. When you're streamer fishing, strip downstream. A lot of times streamer fishermen will cast kind of forward, let it sink, and as the boat passes, then start stripping. That's fine. But you always want to be stripping downstream. River right, river left, we talked about that. All right, so everybody that doesn't have, well, even iPhones have a fake clock face nowadays. So it's really important to understand, the dial of a clock when you're fishing. At least for us when we're guiding, we like to tell people, hey, cast to 1 o'clock, cast to 2 o'clock, cast to 10 o'clock. So that's great direction as far as where to tell people to cast. Notice that everything is based off of the center of the boat. So if it's 3 o'clock, I say cast at 3 o'clock, the front angler's actually going to have to cast slightly behind him. When I say cast at 3 o'clock, that front angler typically casts over to 2 o'clock, which is the wrong spot. So you want to have that conversation. Make sure that everybody understands the vocabulary that's being used throughout the day as far as where to cast. You as the rower, you have the advantage of looking downstream and knowing what's coming up and what the target is. The fisherman's going to be more focused on the target and their fly line and what it's doing. So they're not necessarily going to be looking downstream. So as the rower, prepare the fisherman, prepare the angler to cast in the right location. we always talk about where to cast based on the clock face. We just wanted to show some fish porn. So that's a big fish on a streamer. I was up on the upper Colorado River. Yeah, just fish porn. Okay, front fishermen, back fishermen. Big difference here. So if you are in the front of the boat, you want to cast to that 2 o'clock to 12 o'clock type position unless the rower tells you otherwise. If you're in the back of the boat, you're casting from 3 o'clock to 2 o'clock. So if you look at this, you notice that both anglers have an opportunity to cast where the boat has not been or where the shadow has not been. So if the front angler is casting over here, then the back angler is stuck casting back here, and that's water that the shadow's already gone through, the boat's already gone through, and it's probably spooked fish. So again, always be casting more downstream. Okay, so targets. Let's talk about targets real quick. So we always break it up into smaller pieces. So as you're floating downstream, if you're in a personal pontoon, a raft, a dory, whatever it is, you want to look for these types of attributes, okay? So up here you have a cut bank. Does everybody understand what a cut bank is? So it's where the water goes around a turn and it erodes the land out underneath. So when you're standing on the ground, it's over water. So it's eroded the bank out underneath you. That's called a cut bank. Fish love cut banks. The outside bend, they're always on the outside bend. Here is an inside bend. So as the water flows from top to bottom, the water comes around this way, and it's going to create an eddy line right in this area here. And this is an eddy where the water is going to flow up. So fish like to hang out behind peninsulas. They hang out behind rocks. They go up and feed and come back down. Up and feed and come back down. So if you see that structure where water's coming off, it's also known as a ledge. We love ledges as guides. Ledges are absolutely wonderful. So you're going to want to kind of position the boat down here. You're going to cast up into the faster water, let it drift over the ledge, drop down, and then hopefully a fish will take it at that point. So a ledge there. These are just rocks, boulders, so fish hang out around boulders. Again, they break up the current. They're shelter, so look for that. Islands create convergence of currents. So through here, after the water flows through all these islands, it's going to converge in this area here, and you have a bubble line should be down in here. So as you look downstream, you want to break it into smaller pieces and figure out what targets they're hanging out in and where to go. So again, just understand what you're looking for. Look for that pocket. Look for an eddy. Look for a seam. A few more fish. This was caught 2 weeks ago on the lower Colorado. Okay, everybody know where this is? Does anybody know where this is, I should say? Dennis, you don't count. What's that?
Just above 2 bridges?
Yeah, it's a ways up 2 bridges. So this is, these are the campsites at Pump House. Okay? As you're floating down the river, most people don't realize how divided and braided this section is at Pump House. It is absolutely one of the most fishiest places on the upper Colorado. We know it as the islands area up by Pump House. So you have all kinds of opportunities here. So the river actually comes through here, and you can get a boat down around this bend through this area. Through this area in here, it's a little bit skinny. There's a huge eddy in this corner. The current comes around. You have a bunch of little pockets and bouldery water. There's a big ledge here. All these seams converge along this area, and there's a person standing right here. There's actually a ledge that runs from here to there. So it runs diagonal across this river here. So again, get yourself an understanding of where you're floating so you can be prepared for this stuff. This picture I took as I'm shuttling back from Radium to Pump House. It's a vantage point. You can pull over, take a look at it, and you see all of this from that vantage point. An iPhone does great, or an Android if you're one of those people. But an iPhone does really well. Go to Google Earth, and you could zoom in on stuff. So as you're floating down the river, take a look at your phone if you have service and see what's coming up. you could zoom in and see structure that you haven't gotten to yet. So don't be afraid to do that. But break everything down into pieces. Figure out where are the fish hanging out, what's the fishy water. So some floating tactics. Inside bends, we talked about that. So here you have the boat on the inside of an eddy. You're casting out, the current's going from left to right. You're casting out and you're hitting all these seams along here as the current goes around. The fastest current's along this area, and it slows down as you come inside. So inside bends, eddies. Some casting tips. I'm just going to go through these so I make sure I hit them all. One of the biggest things we always talk about when you're casting, you're in a boat, 13 foot, 14 foot. Your buddy is only 10 feet behind you. The guy that's rowing is 5 feet behind you. Crimp your hooks. It's not about the fish, it's about yourselves. So it's just much easier to get a fly out of the boat, out of yourself, when they are crimped. And it really is about the fish, don't get me wrong. So crimp the hooks, save the fish as well. You always want to be fishing the same side of the boat. So if you have somebody in the front casting to the left, you have somebody in the right, or in the back of the boat casting to the right, their lines are doing this all day long, I guarantee they're going to get tangled up more than if their lines are doing this all day long. So always fish the same side of the boat. As the rower, you want to have the boat in position so they can fish the same side of the boat. So keep that in mind. The pickup laydown cast, it's really important when you're fly fishing out of a boat. So if you get a hit, the indicator, simply, twists or turns or dips, or your dry fly, something rises for it and you didn't get it, you want to go ahead and set. And if you didn't get the fish, pull that line hard enough so it comes out of the water, goes all the way back behind you, and you can lay it right back down in the same spot. So a pickup lay down is really important. One of the worst things that I see that happens when you're out there is somebody will go ahead and they go to set and they stop. And all that line comes right up, hits your fly rod, and you have a tangled mess for the next 20 minutes. You're not catching anything. So again, it's a pickup, so you can't, just like you're casting, go all the way back, let that line straighten out, and then go right back forward. A roll cast is really important. So when you're fishing from shore, you typically roll cast to keep things out of the bushes behind you or out of the tree behind you. But in the boat, you want to avoid bringing that fly line over the rower, over the back seat angler. So if you could roll cast, that makes things much easier. Sidearm cast, keep it down out of the wind. The person in the back of the boat, if you get tangled up, it's always your fault. Always, 100%, the person in the back, it's their fault. So whoever's in the back of the boat can see when the guy in the front of the boat is casting. Just don't cast. Let them get the line down, give them a chance, and then go ahead and cast afterwards. So, and again, just look downstream and be prepared. Oh, always in different depths. So that's the other thing. When you're floating, your boat, you're going to float over a stretch of water that might be a foot deep, might be 10 feet deep, might be 3 feet deep. It always changes. The river bottom always changes. So you're always in different depths as you're floating. But once you know where the fish are holding, that's where you set your depth. And then you target those holes. So if you know the fish are 6 feet down at the bottom of a ledge, and that's where they're hanging out because you're catching them, well, great. Then don't rig your hopper dropper for only 2 feet or 3 feet. It makes no sense. So figure out what the depth is and only fish that one depth, even though you're always in different depths throughout the day. Okay, so typically you have two fishermen. You want to get them both to the feeding area for the fish. If the boat moves, then the target moves. So think of it that way. So if you have two anglers that can cast 20 feet, and that's all they can cast, and you have that boat positioned perfect 20 feet away from that hole that's coming up, and as you're rowing backwards to slow down, you're rowing at an angle and you're pulling away from that target, now all of a sudden that target's going to be 30 feet or 40 feet. So those anglers have to adjust, sometimes in the middle of the cast. So it's really, really important that you keep the boat in line with whatever that target is as you float by it. Very subtle movements. So you want to do everything slowly when you're fishing. You're going to row backwards, you're going to slow the boat down. You're not going to do 45 angle ferries across the river. You're going to do 25 degree angles across the river. So do everything very subtle movements. Why? Because you don't want to spook fish. That's the biggest reason. A lot of times you have beginning rowers that they don't understand that an oar goes in the water quietly if it's vertical. It's a little bit louder if it's horizontal. So be thinking about noise. It's not, hey, you can't talk when you're out fishing, although I tell my wife that all the time. Shh, stop talking, we're fishing. It's about doing the splashing and different things like that. So don't spook the fish. Okay, how many of you guys know the crawl stroke? Okay, so the crawl stroke is where you can keep the boat pointed parallel to the shore, and then move right or left. So you're going to ferry the boat right or left without angling it. So the crawl stroke is something that's very important. So you have one oar pointed forwards, and you're basically just pushing the boat to the side that you want to move to. And then your other oar, your opposite oar, is keeping it straight. So it's a really important stroke. There's all kinds of videos out there on YouTube. It's very difficult to demonstrate with a beer and pointer in my hand and not in a boat. So I can't do that right now. But go on YouTube, type in crawl stroke, and make sure you guys understand that.
Isn't it the same thing as a fry in a pool?
Yeah, exactly. Yep, exactly right. Okay, the other thing too is it allows the boat to be very close to shore. So if you are able to do a crawl stroke and you have a bank only 5 feet away from you on your right side, you can get that right oar directly in front of you and push it sideways while your left oar is then maneuvering the angle of the boat, and allows you to slow things down very close to shore if you have an eddy line off to your left or right, either way. Okay, what equipment's needed? So when you're float fishing, a couple things. You need to be able to float. I don't ever recommend float fishing while you go out wade fishing. It's not a good recipe for the end of the day. You're always really wet. So a boat works really well. The biggest thing on boats is you want to have something that's rigged for an angler. It makes life so much better, and it makes your day so much more comfortable. So you'll see, downriver they make a great rowing frame, fishing frame with lean bars. So the lean bars, you can stand up and fish, and you're in that lean bar. You're between the horns. As the boat turns, you're staying there. You're not going to fall out of the boat. Drift boats have those built in the bow, and they also have it typically in the back of the boat. This is a really bad example. These two guys, me in the back, unfortunately. It's a boat. It's not rigged for fishing at all. And anytime that we would turn as anglers, you're moving all over the place. So that's kind of a bad example there. So get something that's purposely built for fishing. It'll make your day so much more comfortable. A stable floor is really nice. So downriver makes the diamond plate decks for the front and the back of the boat. When we're guiding, we all have a solid floor for our anglers to stand on. It makes it that much easier. An anchor is critical. You want to be able to stop the boat if you're in public water at any time to untangle, to unnet a fish, to re-rig. An anchor comes in really handy.
What kind of anchor do you use in Colorado?
Heavy. So there's a couple different schools of thoughts. Some of our guides run the pyramid anchor. Myself, I run the big, gnarly barbell with spikes on it. They're all about 35 pounds for a 13 or 14 foot boat. You need something heavy. Honestly, a 35-pound dumbbell works just fine. But they have the pyramid anchor here. It's smaller. It's a smaller silhouette. Those work really good in rocky and or something that's sandy or gravel bar or something like that. They're a little bit better for the type of water that we have out here. I'm all over the place, so I have just a big gnarly barbell thing. Handle with a long net. There's nothing worse than missing a fish because you brought your wading net with you when you're in a boat. So get a boat net. It's better on the fish. It's better on you. Less likelihood to fall overboard. Okay, so some other equipment that's needed when you're floating. Let's go there. So safety equipment. So just like you would with your whitewater rafting, bring extra clothes. Even though you have boots and waders on in the spring or fall, or if it's in the summertime and you don't mind getting wet, that water's still really cold. So bring an extra set of clothes with you. Keep them dry. We always recommend a 9-foot rod, 5-weight or 6-weight here in Colorado. I tend more towards a 6-weight when you're floating. Typically, you're casting a little bit further. Typically, you're in the wind a little bit more, and that 6-weight cuts through the wind that much better. Fluorocarbon tippet, it's abrasion resistant compared to monofilament. Again, have multiple setups, and bring multiple flies. You're going to lose flies when you're float fishing, just without a doubt. You can't go upriver and free them off the bottom of the water. All right, so how do you get better at rowing for fishing? We talked about a whole bunch of stuff. Really, the only way to do it is to get out and spend time on the sticks. So even if it's just you and you're not necessarily going to be fishing and you're just going to go from fishing hole to fishing hole, well, between those areas, row like you have a passenger. Practice. Actually slow down, pull into eddies, and look for those targets. So spend time on the sticks and think about it. Take a lesson. I do rowing lessons. We do a guide school. It's going on actually. The last half of guide school is tomorrow. So we're underwater for the next 3 days. But take a lesson. Learn how to row for fishing from being on the water. And this is something, it's not just because I'm a guide. I do this all the time when we go someplace and you're not familiar with the water. Hire a guide. So let's say that you're going up to the Bighorn and you're going to be there for a week and you have a boat. Well, great. It's going to take you the week to learn the water. If you hire a guide, go out the first day with the guide, they're going to show you everything. They're going to show you where all the fish are and what they're hitting on and all that stuff. And then you have the rest of the time to catch more fish on your own. So hire a guide for a little bit of reconnaissance work. The rower is always responsible for getting the boat down safely first. Fishing, it's always second. I don't know how many times throughout the year, Dennis, you see it all the time. There's guides that have been floating for 15, 20, 30 years on pump house, and they still float and sink a drift boat. They still puncture a raft. It happens, and it happens very fast. So make sure that you're always looking at safety first. That's about it.